that's perfect for me.
All right, awesome. Great, thanks. We're underway. Thank you so much.
All right. Let me start the screen share here and then go into that. All right, and then yeah, if there are any issues with seeing the screen, yeah, just let me know. Um, but yeah, as Matt said, my name's Ethan Bean. I'm an archaeologist with the federal government, with the Army Corps of Engineers out of Baltimore. So our offices are in downtown Baltimore. Um, and as part of that job, I mostly deal with our civil works projects. So think stream restoration, environmental restoration, flood risk management, that kind of stuff. But also a component that I help with are our operations projects. So as we'll kind of get into later on in the presentation, we do operations and maintenance on a number of federal navigation channels and shipping channels through the Chesapeake Bay. So I kind of support the cultural resources work with those. Um, yeah, as far as the archaeology club, yeah, I was talking with Matt earlier. I'm not quite a founding member, but I think I got in a little before COVID. I'm not actually sure when the club was founded, but yeah, been here for a while, so I'm happy to finally, come on board and share one of our projects with you and share its story. Um, oh, and some, I guess, like housekeeping stuff. I did want to apologize. I got kind of called in for some impromptu archaeological field work in Pennsylvania. So I am on hotel Wi-Fi right now. Hopefully that sticks. But been doing that for a bit. So I apologize if this is a little unorganized at times. We'll see. The other thing I did want to mention is that my training is in um, pretty much all terrestrial archaeology, so the archaeology on land, whereas this project was all maritime underwater archaeology. So with that, if there are any questions about that, I'll do my best to answer them to my ability, but I can also get you answers to any questions that I don't know. So as far as the presentation, yeah, the title here, Finding the Shipwreck Polynia within the framework of Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. So you have a really good depiction of the Polynia here off to the right, and that's the ship we'll go into detail here in a bit. Um, a little bit more of an introduction. So what I'm going to be talking about here is the Army Corps of Engineers work. So the more details on the specific project, where the shipwreck was found, and kind of the roles of people involved. Um, and alongside talking about the shipwreck, I thought this was going to be a really good opportunity to kind of talk about Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, just to give you, in case you weren't aware of that process or that law, just to kind of give you more information about it, and because it's the framework that this project was operating within, especially in reference to cultural resources and archaeological work. Um, and so then, kind of to close it out, we'll talk about the ship itself, the Polinia, and its development through time, and kind of some research that has gone on through that or on that shipwreck. So talking about the project a little bit, the actual project name when the ship was found was the Wolf Trap Alternate Placement Site Northern Extension Project. So like I mentioned before, how our agency operates and maintains a number of federal channels throughout the bay. The figure on the left here shows a slice, a chunk of those projects. And so you can see quite a few channels and then a few placement sites for those channels. And so what happens is so we've dredged these channels to a certain foot and or to a certain depth, and over time, sediments accumulate in those channels, and you kind of have to maintain that depth. And so you dredge out that material, and then that has to go somewhere. And so um, for this project, the original placement site for that material was called the Wolf Trap Alternate Open Water Placement Site, which you can see in the figure to the right here. It's the original one was the light blue box, kind of the southernlymost uh, blue box there was the original placement site. Now, 2018, 2019 or so, we received a request to evaluate an extension on that placement site, basically to place material in a different location, mostly because there were concerns about crabs being located in that original placement site. So we were asked to evaluate something else, a new location for these sediments, and so then that kind of spawned the existing Northern Extension project. And so with federal agencies, what happens here is when you use in these projects, when you start evaluating them, you have to go through a process and operate within a law called the National Environmental Policy Act, which essentially just gets into federal agencies need to evaluate uh, how their projects are affecting natural and cultural resources. So we started that evaluation, and then within that, and it's a separate law, but alongside that, we started conducting our Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act um, compliance and evaluation. And so through that, there are a number of steps, which I'll get into here. Um, so there are typically four steps with that process, that law, and the first one is to actually initiate the process and establish that your project is an undertaking that needs to go through this review process. And by undertaking, I mean essentially a federal project that could be federally funded. There's some sort of federal involvement, basically anything where there's a federal hook in that project or that process, it has to go through this Section 106 review. Has to go through these four processes here. And so you initiate it, you establish that you do have an undertaking that needs to go through this. And so then you start establishing your boundary of the project, and you ask yourself and try to find people who might be interested in the project area. And that uh, I mean, from a regulatory standpoint, that includes your state historic preservation office, any American Indian tribes who have maybe an ancestral interest or direct ties to the area where your project is. But it could also be museums, historical societies, um, friends groups, any kind of organization that would have an interest in your project. So, for example, the Natural History Society of Maryland could be a consulting party on projects if they had that interest. But then later on, you also involve the public in the process. And so through this, once you have your project, you found people who are interested. You go back to your project area and you need to identify if there are historic properties within that. And so for us, it's that new placement site. And so for this project, um, that new placement site had never been disturbed, never been used, had never been surveyed archaeologically. So really, it was kind of just a giant question mark. We don't know if there are historic properties in there. So what happens is then you have to go and look for them. You have to essentially kind of clear your area of any cultural resources or historic properties and make sure you're not affecting them. So what we did is we contracted a cultural resources management firm named Search. You may have heard of them. I think they have a documentary on Nat Geo um, that I've seen, which is really good. But they're a pretty prominent CRM group. So we contracted them to design a survey for us and essentially go out and look to see if there are historic properties in that project area. And that could be shipwrecks, sunken aircraft, anything that could have sunk to the bottom could be underwater there. And so kind of as part of that, if you did find something, then you have to evaluate it and see if it's eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. And so if you found something, but it's not eligible for that, then that kind of kicks you out of the Section 106 review process and you're done. But if you did find something and it is potentially eligible, or you just don't know, then you have to proceed to the next step, which is assess adverse effects. And so you have to you have to see if your project would adversely affect that resource. Um, and so then if it's determined eligible, and then also your project is adversely affecting that resource, then you go on to the final step here where you seek to resolve those adverse effects, which kind of gets into a few more steps with that. So I wanted to mention that process just in case anyone wasn't aware. The pamphlet that I have shown here on the far right is from the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. That's a really good introductory pamphlet on this process that you could read through if you wanted. Yeah, just gives a really good information on the process as a whole and general outcomes and what you could expect and how you could get involved if you think you have a project that you're interested in. So I'll flip back actually. So we're on this second step here, identify historic properties. And so again, this placement area, we don't know what's in it, so we've contracted search to go out and archaeologically survey that area. So typically this starts with some background research because maybe you can do some literature reviews or archival research, and you can look at old navigational charts or maps. Or county histories or newspaper records, and you can maybe get a sense of a little bit of the history of your project area to add context to it and see what to get a feel for what you could potentially find in that area. So it started with that, and so there were a few things that kind of popped out of that gave context. But the more technical things that happen during these surveys are a suite um, of three things that include the side scan sonar, which is in the top right, the Edge Tech um, Edge Tech machine there. And then which that sends out acoustic signals that can show you what's on the bottom of the seafloor. And then there's also the magnetometer, which is on the bottom left, that will detect changes in the magnetic fields of your project area, detect those changes. And then the final one here that's typically used is in the bottom right, the sub-bottom profiler. So that, like the side scan sonar, that will send out acoustic signals and will show you a profile of what is underneath the seafloor up to a certain depth. Um, I don't go into too much detail on that one, but that's a good way to see if there are buried river channels, which I think we actually had in this project, but we've had in a few other projects where you can clearly see an old river channel that's been buried by modern sediment. And so, search went out. They used those three machines and did the survey. And one of the more prominent things that came out was this shipwreck here, which turned out to be, well, most likely to be the Polynia. Um, But I tried to find I tried to find a good figure for how side scan sonar works or kind of a depiction of it. So hopefully you can see that. I don't know, but the the unit gets towed behind a vessel and above the seafloor, and it sends out those acoustic signals to the left and right, and shows you the kinds of images that you see here to the right. And so, again, this was one of the more prominent images that came out of this survey, and um, you can see the bow up towards the top portion of the slide, and then you can see a more square stern in the bottom portion of the slide, which I'll get into a little bit. It wasn't originally square. That was a modification. Um, but you can see some more detailing in the hull there. And you can within the software you can kind of get a sense of the length and the width or beam of this vessel. And so um, that was one of the more interesting things that kind of came out of this imagery. And so going on to magnetometry, you can confirm what you're finding or add more context to it. And so with this, again, it's detecting changes in the magnetic field. And so you have these negative contours here oriented more to the north, and then you have these positive contours oriented more to the south. And then you see the outline of the shipwreck there. And so you see that there are kind of a lot of contours happening within this figure. And so it's really suggesting that the vessel is of all metal construction, in this case, iron construction. Just a lot of magnetic material coming out of this. And so again, I don't have a sub-bottom profiler image before I go on to the next slide, but that essentially shows you almost like a seismograph. It shows you a profile of below the seafloor, and you can kind of get a sense of things that may be under there. So going into a little bit more context about the Polynia, so we've seen that side scan sonar image, which is really neat because that's an image of how it is right now. If you were to go down there right now, that's how it is. That's where almost where that story ends. But it's just really interesting thinking about that. It's right there right now. But going into a little bit more context here. Um, the ship was built by Ward Stanton and Company in New York, so it wasn't originally a Chesapeake Bay vessel. It was built and operated in New York for a while, but it was commissioned by an individual named James Gordon Bennett Jr., which some of you may have heard of. I don't know. He through this research, it was kind of found out that he was rather famous for his day, and he's really the embodiment of a Gilded Age individual. Just a very, very wealthy person having all sorts of strange antics. Um, and so he kind of going into him for a little bit. I mean, he served in the Union Navy. He's kind of more well known as the owner and publisher of the New York Herald newspaper. That he received from his father in around 1867 or so. It's the same newspaper that Abraham Lincoln was said to have read a lot during the Civil War, just for its coverage. Um, he really was a newspaper founder. He founded, I believe, one or two others before the New York Herald that were sensational kind of gossip newspapers. So he really loved the gossip and sensational headlines. And so I, for that, since I think the anniversary of the Titanic was a few days ago, but yesterday maybe, it showed the New York Herald headline for that, and with the Lusitania, I think that was actually maybe one of the last uh, articles that he had published. 'Cause he passed away in 1918, I believe. So getting there, but. Um, Again, on to him, kind of serves in the Union Navy during the Civil War. Another event that he's famous for is he won a yacht race. It was a transatlantic yacht race that he won on a bet. So there was that. He was the youngest Commodore of the New York Yacht Club. So he's really into boating and being on yachts, basically. Antics wise, like I said, there are stories where he tipped someone $30,000 just kind of on a whim. He's on cover of Vanity Fair. He's like strolling through the streets, doing odd things. But yeah, just kind of the embodiment of a Gilded Age individual with his wealth anyway. Um, So 1880 is the time when he commissions the steam yacht Polynia to be constructed in New York. And so um, again, we're kind of back to that depiction, that painting in the upper right here of the steam yacht Polynia. You get a sense of what it would have looked like at that time, as well as the image below. Um, so as far as dimensions and kind of more technical aspects, when it was constructed as or at 142 feet long, with a beam or width of around 18 feet. We don't, there's a li only a little bit about the interior of the vessel, which I'll kind of get into a comparison and talk about that in another slide. But from some sources, it's listing the interiors as mahogany with silver-plated nickel mountings. So we kind of know that that material was in there. Um, from a technical standpoint, it could achieve 700 horsepower, could go up to 17 knots. And then it was schooner rigged with the three masts that you see there that range from around 43 to 50 feet, 50 feet tall, depending on which one you're talking about. Um, so you get a really good sense of how that vessel looked when it was originally constructed. And pretty soon after it's constructed, one of the more interesting stories. Oh, and I should mention that um, the construction, the hull type is iron. It's an iron steam yacht, so steam powered iron construction yacht. And when I first heard that, that was a little surprising because I don't know, you just didn't really consider iron construction for a yacht. Kind of seems a little too heavy for the vessel. I don't know, but um, one of the more interesting stories that came out of this project was that pretty soon after its construction in 1880, this iron steam yacht was was in a race with a yacht that was not iron construction. So you would think that the wooden vessel would kind of win that race, but James Gordon Bennett Jr. won a race with an iron steam yacht, and that's kind of one of the more interesting stories that happens after its construction. After that, it doesn't really it kind of falls out of favor. I want to say because it's probably a little still slower overall than its wooden counterparts. And so by 1882, Bennett Jr. He's constructed a different vessel, which we'll see in a second, the Namuna, which is a little bit more depicted in the historical record. Yeah, and so like I mentioned previously, we really don't know a whole lot about the interiors of the Polinia, but we can do some comparisons with his later yacht, the Namuna. So these are all from Harper's Weekly magazine in the late 19th century. So actually, in the top right, you get the drawing of the main saloon. Then below that, you get a depiction of the bedroom. And then going to the left, you see the owner's room, and then a portion of the ladies' room and the ladies' saloon in the far left there. And so that gives you a little bit of a depiction of what the interiors could have looked like. Yeah, and again, I mentioned that the Namuna was a little bit better represented in these records. Um, These are paintings done by an artist named Julius LeBlanc Stewart in the late 1800s. Again, these are of Bennett Jr.'s later vessel on the Namuna, but it gives you, again, a depiction of what um, kinds of things you could expect on a steam yacht. And since these are in color, it gives you a better sense of that as well. But you can see the kind of goings on and the social life on these yachts as they're kind of going to and from places and racing. He really loved racing his yachts. And then I included these slides just a little bit for comparison purposes. The two on the left are that later vessel that I was mentioning, the Semya Namuna. That one three-masted steamer as well, and then the one on the right here, the steam yacht Corsair, which was owned by a different individual, but kind of gives you a good comparison, I think. So. Um, So the Polynia, so constructed in 1880, it has an interesting story. It kind of it bounces around a little bit. For a while, it's in New York, um, but in 1885, so only 5 years after it's constructed, or owned by Bennett Jr. It's sold to William Starbuck and remains in New York. And then by 1898, it's sold to another individual named Louis Lukenbach, um, who actually tries to offload it for use in the Spanish-American War, but he's unsuccessful in that, or it's not accepted as a vessel that the Navy wants. But um, so only a year later, he sells it to a New York Yacht Club member named Fred Osgood, who has it for a little bit. But this is where the story of the vessel changes a little bit because I mentioned previously that um, in that side scan sonar image, there was a square stern. There was a modification. Well, in 1911, the vessel was sold to Menhaden Fisheries Company, and that's when it's around that time it's pretty much completely overhauled and modified to be a fishing vessel. And I have examples of those in these two figures here. These are not of the vessel Polynia that was renamed the Tillie. These are just kind of examples for comparison purposes. Um, so that occurs in 1911, and then 1913 it's sold again to another company, uh, George R. Dilks and Company, that's operating out of Baltimore, Maryland. And so in this early 1900s time frame, that's when it's been overhauled and moved to the Chesapeake Bay area. And then, unfortunately, the story of the Polynia slash Tillie kind of takes a turn when it sinks near the Wolf Trap Lighthouse, where it's carrying coal to the Bethlehem Steel Company in Baltimore. And so you have a newspaper article of that event in the far or in the bottom right here. And so sinks in 1917 and then is discovered, rediscovered, I guess, a little over 100 years after the fact. And so some additional research that I did on this vessel. More so when it was the Plinia, when it was more so an iron steam yacht. Um, Again, I was saying, that an iron steam yacht, that's kind of interesting. That's you don't really hear of that, and especially that it's been in a race and has won a race with a non-iron hulled vessel. Um, and so I wanted to, I kind of had the question of, how popular were iron steam yachts? Were they were they a really popular vessel? Were they constructed in large numbers? Like, what's kind of the story on that one? Um, and so to answer that question, if you've never been, there's a resource compiled by the Mystic Seaport Museum out in Connecticut. They have a whole list of American yacht registers that have very good details on um, from American yacht inventories from the 1870s all the way to the early 1900s, I believe. But they give a lot of details as far as the name, who owns them, what kind of rigging they have, how much they weigh, um, the dimensions, and length, width, their draft, um, builders' names, and when it was built. And which clubs they belong to as well. And so going through these lists, I went through Um, the ones from 1874 all the way to 1886, and some of those weren't digitized, so I didn't include those. But went through those lists to try and find which ones were noted with iron vessel construction because they noted that in these. And you can kind of see in the chart on the right here that um, it was a very small percentage of vessels that were noted with iron hull construction, um, especially from the early days in the 1870s when they really weren't constructed at all, and then they uh, gained a little bit of popularity, it seems, in the 1880s. Um, and then after that, I don't really have the information to say. I'm assuming they declined, but that's I'd have to probably go to the actual museum and find the actual records to do more of that. So that was interesting to find out and kind of give context to iron hull construction there. Yeah, and so for conclusions with this, from that research, the Polynia here, it seems to be representing one of the earliest examples of an iron steam yacht, because a rise in popularity in the 1880s, but they're not really constructed too much in the 1870s. So this seems to be one of the earliest ones that was constructed or that has been found. And so so going back to that Section 106 review process, so we've in our project area, we've found a resource, we found a shipwreck. And so what needs to happen is that we need to evaluate its eligibility for the National Register of Historic Places. And so that's kind of the step where we're at now. Um, the interested parties in that project were the Virginia SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office, the Naval History and Heritage Command down in Virginia, as well as the Mariners Museum. They were all interested parties in this, and we essentially signed an agreement that said we'll avoid the shipwreck. We won't place material on it. We'll kind of place material in other areas. But if we ever were to propose placing material there, then we would basically do additional investigations to evaluate that eligibility and see if it could be listed on the National Register. And so then just again, reviewing American Yacht Register records from the 1800s there, indicates that really iron-hulled vessels weren't all that popular, um, well, at all. I mean, they sort of rose in popularity in the 1880s, but they remained a low percentage of overall listings. And so again, the lasting images here of the Plinia, kind of at its construction and in use, and then 100 years later, um, well, after it's sinking, finding it again and kind of retelling its story and relearning about it, which was really interesting because that just doesn't happen a lot for our projects. Um, so yeah, I will stop there and I'll take any questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Ethan. There's a question in the chat here from Kristen. Do we know anything about how the iron content has affected the surrounding wildlife? Is the iron a non-factor?
I don't have a definite answer on that. The iron a non-factor. I'm more inclined to say that there hasn't really been, um, I guess, any studies on how the iron has affected anything. Um, but there doesn't seem to be any elevated levels of dangerous things, I suppose. But yeah, that's a really good question.
So what was the process like when you found the shipwreck?
Yeah, so the process was so so within that Section 106 process, so search gave us the report. They alerted us that, hey, there's a shipwreck here. Um, and our recommendations are, avoid it, or if you can't avoid it, um, then work with your state historic preservation office to see about ways that you can mitigate any adverse effects to it. Um, and so the process was we essentially worked out a formal agreement that separated the placement area into different or looked at it in different cells. And so right now we place in a cell where the shipwreck is not located. So we just chose to completely avoid the shipwreck.
Some more questions coming in on the chat. I don't know if you can see these, Ethan. Is there an estimate of how many sunken ships may be in the Chesapeake?
Yeah, that's a really good one. Unfortunately, I don't have a definite one on that. It's got to be in the thousands. Um, just because there are so many, not even just historic shipwrecks, but maybe even more modern craft that just have had accidents and gone down. Um, but there are at least, I believe over 1,000 in the various State Historic Preservation Office databases that I looked at as part of this project. Um, but then there's also, I mean, all the ones that have been undocumented and that people just don't know about. So, like, I mean, the Polynia, for example, no one knew about it. It really wasn't until the survey um, that we were able to document its position and say that, yeah, there's a sunken vessel right there.
So, what's the depth of the Polynia, and is there any interest in raising the hull?
Yeah, so for the depth, it's around 35 feet. Um, that's how far down it was. As far as any ra interest in raising the hull, not at this time. I think that in the future, if we were to, let's say we had to place that dredged sediment where the shipwreck was, um, there may be interest at that time, kind of just depending on project details. Um, but that would be a really interesting endeavor, I think, which that if that scenario ever happens, that wouldn't be for decades, I believe.
What is the vital information that truly identifies the ship? Has anyone dived for artifacts that prove it?
Yeah, so this is a almost like I guess I should say like it's most likely this kind of thing. Um, Mostly because of uh, the newspaper records that kind of talk about where it sank and the dimensions that are recorded here. The dimensions that are recorded here in this side scan sonar image, they were dead on with its modification. Um, they're the other thing too is the magnetometry data. Which I'll try to, oh, there it is. Um, this with how many contours there are and with what's showing up in this image really suggests that it is an iron-hulled vessel. Um, so as with a lot in archaeology, it's, putting pieces of context together to kind of form the bigger picture. And with a lot of that information, it really suggests that this um, is that vessel. Has anyone dived for artifacts that prove it? No, there haven't been any diver investigations that I know of on this vessel, at least not part of our efforts.
Ethan, what's the oldest ship that has been found in the Chesapeake?
Hmm. I want to say technically, probably a dugout canoe, possibly. Um,
Probably not a ship per se.
right. Um, but what is the oldest ship? Yeah, honestly, unfortunately, I don't know. It would. Because the thing with earlier ships, so they're wood like colonial ships with their wooden construction, and so they maybe a little more deteriorated. Maybe site formation processes just have occurred so much that you really can't. Um, it's hard to find them in the archaeological record. So I'm unsure of the oldest.
So Jackie is suggesting possibly the Debraak. I'm sorry about the pronunciation. Debraak. Sounds Dutch.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I don't know.
Sure.
Oh, and I did want to add some while I'm on this slide, because this is really interesting that um, so when you have a a shipwreck with a lot of metal, basically, whether the hull is metal or there's just a lot of metal artifacts or resources on it. Um, this really interesting thing happens because you can see it in this image that you have negative contours towards the north and positive contours to the south. Um, what tends to happen with shipwrecks is that these contours, the magnetism gets is naturally oriented to Earth's magnetic field, and so a lot of these shipwrecks they have this same profile here where you have the negatives pointing to the north and positive pointing towards the south. And so in a lot of these reports and a lot of these investigations, you get these profiles that kind of help you in a sense figure out if something is a shipwreck or not based on these.
So is there a next step for this specific ship? Well, what's the next step in the process?
Yeah, next step is so we keep operating under that agreement that I mentioned. So it's essentially we update the consulting parties every year and say that we're continuing to avoid the shipwreck. We're not placing any material on it. Um, but basically we are if we ever were to place material there or on anything else that we would alert everybody and tell them that we're going to do so that we can all evaluate further potential impacts.
So, do people dive for shipwrecks in the Chesapeake the way that treasure hunters have done off the coast of Florida? Are there laws or regulations preventing this?
Yeah, so people do dive for shipwrecks. I don't know how because I want to say one of the more famous cases is off Assateague Island, I think, with some vessels that were European in nature or origin. But it does happen where, yeah, people will dive for shipwrecks in the Chesapeake. I don't think it's as prominent as it is in Florida or other areas because the visibility is so low, but it does happen. As far as laws and regulations preventing that, there is the Abandoned Shipwrecks Act, which um, essentially kind of says that any vessels that are, I believe it's on state, um, in state waters or embedded in um, state boundaries or in a state's seafloor, basically, that it belongs to the state and it's under their purview. I may be quoting that incorrectly, but so that's one law that does prevent that. Um, if let's say there was a shipwreck that um, was maybe a National Historic Landmark that or part of maybe it was owned by, let's say, the National Park Service, and so that it was federal property. You have several laws there that would come into play that could protect that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Other questions? Thank you, Ethan. I really appreciate that. That was really interesting. So I think that's it. It's getting close to 8, so we'll wrap things up. And I know, Ethan, you have been out in the field and you're in a hotel right now, so we won't keep you any longer. Appreciate your time. Thanks, everyone. Happy Passover, happy Easter to those who celebrate. Please join us next month for a talk by Zach Singer on the Ice Age people in Maryland. And take care, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for having me.